American Heritage Month, which is dedicated for May, and it is to commemorate the immigration of first Japanese to the U.S. and completion of transcontinental railroad that was made possible by thousands of Chinese. So AAPI month elevates the stories, contributions, and experiences of the Asian and Asian American communities. So today we have a very special guest with us, Angie Lee. She is a partner and design director of the interiors at FXCollaborative, New York City-based architecture, interior, and planning design firm. With over 25 years of experience, she integrates emotional design, narrative, technical precision, and artistic intuition. She leads the firm's award-winning interior practice, and she is also a recipient of 2019 HIP Award for Design Leadership in the Workplace category, and is a president-elect of the International Interior Design Association's International Board of Directors. So, Angie, take it away. We would like to hear your story with a follow-up question Q&A session, and towards the end, we'll open up for our participants Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Nishu, and thank you, everybody, for having me today. I'm going to start sharing my screen. 1 second. What is this? Oh, this is interesting. Maybe that'll work. Hold on 1 second. That is, I have to allow my system to share my screen all of a sudden.
Let me see if it's on our end. It might be, but I don't think so.
Okay.
Oh, who can search?
Oh,
Angie, maybe you could email your presentation to Kim and
Yeah, I was going to suggest.
I'm gonna hold on. I'll be right back.
Okay. Well, I don't think it was on my end, but I'm not sure because we're on the DAC account, not on my office account. So I'm not quite sure, but I thought we've done it in the past where other people have been able to share.
I think I just updated it's working now.
Okay.
I had updated my operating software, so that always screws things up.
Awesome. Yeah, we can definitely see your screen now.
Okay.
Thanks, Angie.
Okay, so Nishu kind of explained who I am, but you know, I wanted to share the beginning of one of the presentations that I often share when I'm asked to do a keynote, and I think this ties in, you know, not always specifically about being part of the AAPI community, but you know, I thought this is very pertinent for our discussion today. This quote from Margaret Jefferson about a book that she wrote called Negroland is about Black excellence and being Black in America, and with a lot of the same kind of pressures and expectations that the Asian community experienced as immigrants in the 60s especially. But you know, this notion of being an other in America teaches you to imagine what can't imagine you. That really resonated with me. And if you replace the word other with designer, it kind of explains for me why I feel like I succeeded at all in this industry. Because this whole enigma, this dilemma actually kind of helps us observe this practice of learning stories that aren't your own, and exercising what I think all creatives must figure out how to do. The story that I'm sharing with you today about being Asian American and Korean American was, I came to this country when I was 2, and with my pigtails, my family took me to the middle of the country to a place called Kansas. By the time I was 3, my parents gave me an easier name for people to understand and pronounce. And they did, in fact, go for the easiest, I think, which was Jane. But during a company picnic from my dad's hospital, I accidentally broke into the estate owner's house, which was off limits, but I think I was 3 at the time. A very nice lady found me in her great hall and asked me what my name was. And I couldn't seem to remember it because, my parents had just told me that my Korean name was no longer my name, and all of a sudden my name was Jane. So I was kind of hemming and hawing until my mom kind of popped up behind me, and she was, very apologetic for my intrusion. But this nice lady was like, she was totally cool, but she asked my mom what my name was, because apparently I had no idea. But my mom hesitated also. As it turns out, my parents hadn't finalized my American name, maybe because all their Korean friends were naming their daughters Jane also. And so this nice lady suggested to my mom, that I looked like an angel, and then perhaps she would consider calling me Angie, which sounds really sweet. But if you think about it, it's really a story of letting a complete stranger name your kid. But actually, this story is an example of a series of experiences that allowed me to feel welcomed into this country between bouts of othering, and understanding a sense of place by belonging to a place means that, in my opinion, you have to have some level of ownership of place. And to be able to design a better world means, in my view, that you dabble in alchemy in a lot of ways, where you convert a space or an experience often from a negative to a positive state. And it's driven me as a designer my entire career to imagine big enough to capture the joy of belonging, to be a catalyst that shifts emotion and experience from bad to better, to good, and hopefully to great. And to understand joy as a designer is to understand how to tell a story. And I learned how to tell the stories of everyone around me first. And I always thought that was a bit backwards, but I have come to realize that for most people, telling your own story is probably the most difficult thing to do. And it may be the most important thing for a designer to really master. Designing for authenticity and the whole selves of not just the people you design for is nearly impossible if you haven't figured out how to do it for yourself. By the time I graduated from Carnegie Mellon, I was I had become a sort of painfully introverted kind of personality, even though I was designing, away, just designing in a corner all by myself, which I was happy to do. But, I'll never forget one of my early sponsors in one of my first jobs out of school would make me read the newspaper out loud in the backseat of his car as he drove the design team to client meetings in Pittsburgh. And it was my worst nightmare, hearing my own voice as my coworkers had to listen to me read about the weather or baseball or whatever was printed on the paper. And as much as I hated those drives, I realize now that I was being forced to create space for myself. I had been trained for my entire, educational path in my life to sort of minimize myself, but creating space for myself was, you know, kind of a really important first step into becoming who I am today. And the ability to communicate through storytelling is how, you know, we translate a sense of belonging through nonverbal design with finishes and lighting and shaping of spatial proportions. And some of my past and present clients actually are, you know, BBC on the right, the New York Stock Exchange in the middle, and GE on the left, as well as, you know, folks like NASDAQ, Amtrak, and MetLife, just to name some of the big kind of Fortune 500 companies that you may have heard of. But for each of these projects, the parameters were really different. The clients were always unpredictable. But the one thing I could rely on is that the fact is that the design never got approved unless it was attached to some kind of story. And, you know, like the latest example that I'm going to share with you, the last example for project work is for Amtrak. You know, we just completed their first class travel lounge in the historic post office mail sorting space at the newly opened Moynihan Train Hall. We built an experience that borrows from the past and aspires to map out the future. And we created a sense of nostalgia for a culture of train travel that was more global and sort of leisurely and more luxe than it really ever was in the US, but it set the table for future travelers that allows for more inclusion. The design process, you know, for the travel lounge was haunted by the memory of the historic Penn Station that was demolished in 1963. But, you know, we looked to the post office for, you know, inspiration, you know, from their exquisitely detailed ceiling. And, you know, the mail sorting hall had these kind of old canvas bags with vintage leather details. And so that kind of gave us this notion of having this sporty elegance for a romantic ideal of train travel that, again, exists mostly in movies and memories from abroad. But, you know, this is from a photo shoot that I did remotely for the art directing because of COVID and a snowstorm. But when travelers come here, they're greeted by spaces that were forged in conversations about, you know, ADA access, mother's rooms, family toilet rooms, and children and family rooms where the furniture could be misappropriated. In addition to the default business traveler, we were mindful of multiple generations occupying the lounge at the same time. A lot of senior travelers take the cross-country sleeper cars and need a certain level of proximity to elevators and train platforms that a red cap service provides for them. So that's kind of, in a very small nutshell, you know, how I have sort of come into being as a designer, a design leader. And I think some of the questions I think that Nishu had, you know, kind of given me a preview for will actually help us understand the fuller story, because I think I'm very much at the beginning of an exploration of identity as an AAPI member, and as a, you know, kind of a 51-year-old just realizing how entrenched she was in the model minority myth and kind of unpacking all of that and trying to go forward in sort of the next chapter of my design career has been very interesting, difficult, and rewarding. So with that, I think that's my little presentation.
Thank you, Angie, for sharing your story. I'm pretty sure it resonated with others too. It definitely did with my story. So everyone keep your questions ready towards the end. So Angie, since you were born in Seoul, South Korea,
Mhm.
and you grew up in Midwest, right?
Yes.
So how important is it for, is the immigration story and the cultural piece of the family for you? So that will be my first, I would like to, or we would like to understand that.
Sure. Well, it's strange because I feel like when I do these kinds of discussions and conversations, I'm always kind of like giving answers that people are not expecting, because I think that immigration was never part of our shared storytelling in my family. It was a blind spot actually that haunted me, because I could feel the missing pieces of my origin story, but I had such a hard time recollecting it because I came when I was a toddler. But I do remember, the naturalization photo of my mom and my sister in black and white, because I still have the photograph today. But I don't even remember how old I was when the citizenship came through. Immigration for us was an event that we just felt lucky enough to have passed. And I don't think my parents felt the need to celebrate it or make it part of the family lore. And after my parents had tried on my American English name for me and then changed it again, I had to sign an official document when I became a citizen as a young kid. And my new name was hard to write out since I had just learned how to write Jane in English. And the sudden pivot, I realize now, looking back, was sort of the first hoop that I jumped through and the cultural assimilation process. And over the course of the years, my identity was consistently altered and sanitized from ethnicity and, protected from the butchers of pronunciation that plagued, us with people mispronouncing our names and kind of hurting our self-esteem and chances at advancement, at least in my parents' worldview. And, my Korean name was actually demoted as my middle name. And my parents stopped speaking to me in Korean most of the time at home in the hopes that I wouldn't have an accent. And they would only speak in Korean when I was in trouble. But I remember them speaking to me in Korean one day, my mom actually, and I didn't understand what she was saying anymore. I think I was a little younger than 6, and the look on her face I'll never forget, because she finally realized that I had lost my native tongue. So even though they were trying to prepare me for a Western world, they never expected me to kind of lose my language. So I feel like the pressures that they felt were so severe to kind of avoid this perpetual foreigner identity, that the backlash was kind of, something that I kind of mourn today. But, I occasionally surprise them by asking about Korea and wanting to know more about the family that we still have back there. And then, I then realized that my curiosity was a trigger into past trauma for them, because they both survived the Korean War. My mom was very open about her experiences, but my father is still deeply affected by, his migration from North Korea to South Korea and losing some family members along the way. But I really hope that we can find, that I can, and collectively we can find ways to tell these stories someday, because they're incredible tales of grit and determination that we now see echoed in all the turmoil surrounding immigration right now.
Very true, yeah. And I'm still waiting for my celebration. So, in my opinion, there are two things which reflects in one's brand. One is the personality, and other is culture. So, how has your Asian American heritage influenced your work as a designer? Like in your interior design, especially
Sure.
with any feng shui, or I know Vastu in India, but was there any influence you had?
So this is where I always feel like I fall short. So there's nothing that I can point to that is specifically, feng shui or anything kind of inspired by Korean architecture or design. But in a way, this kind of blind spot is prevalent in that I was always looking for something that was provocative to the point of almost being subversive. But, you know, because I worked so hard to fit into this country as a survival tactic, I did become really good at, you know, being American from a Midwestern and folksy and also an elitist white lens. I know those adjectives don't go together, but it kind of explains the cognitive dissonance that was my version of normal, where I learned how to imagine what can't imagine me. So it's hard to explain, but you know, I was never really Korean. I was either Japanese or Chinese to people growing up. In first grade, people were always asking me, "Are you Japanese or Chinese?" And I went home and I asked my mom, "Am I Japanese or Chinese?" And she's like, "Oh my God, you're Korean. What don't you understand about that?" But I just didn't know. And of course, I went back to school. I told the kids, I'm Korean. And they said, "There's no such thing as Korean." And I got really mad at my mom. So, you know, there's something to that where I have been able to really learn how to be a storyteller for other people's experiences. And setting aside the unfortunate aspects of that, as a designer, that's still a useful skill to have. And it's kind of a radical empathy that we should all practice. But the twist for me is that it came at such a great cost. And I'm actively now starting to figure out ways to stop paying that cost. Because as an unintended and unhealthy consequence of neglecting oneself and people who look like me or, you know, or part of the AAPI community is just proof that the design of our systemic racism as a system is working. So I think understanding how to design for an Asian diaspora is something that's very much front of mind for me, because I feel like there's this kind of a bit of a tourist between worlds, and I have formed a community with people who are similar to me in that they don't feel like they are Asian enough or American enough, but this kind of hyphenated existence is very rich in terms of what we're able to pull in and sort of process and make our own. So I think everything that I shared with you has some examples of what it means to be an other, as much as that is a terrible label. It is very much a part of this society. So that's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question without answering it.
Yeah, sure. No, it kind of answered my question. So I want to talk a little bit about the representation of our community or Asian community here. So there is a perception that Asians can excel as a great employee, but not as a great, I would say, leaders. So what are your thoughts on representation? If you can share some stories or your experience.
Sure. I think that representation is incredibly important, but it's not enough to just be in the room where it happens. To be a leader that breaks the status quo is to be at risk of incivility or even insubordination. And I think eliminating that risk is essential because it means that we're creating safe spaces to share the expertise of being ourselves. We as Asians and Asian Americans deal with different pressures that non-white, non-male, non-hetero people have. And as clear as that is to me, I mean, that's my life, I have good friends plural, many good friends who just don't believe that Asians have any disadvantages or have to deal with biases in the racial conversation, which is shocking and hurtful in many ways, but it kind of explains why there's such a disconnect, I think, because of the disconnect between the numbers of people who are in the workforce and then the very few who are at leadership levels. There are so many gateways that we have, or gates that we have to go through the higher we go up, and it becomes more and more narrow and defined in terms of how you pass through those tiers to sort of get elevated to leadership levels. And I think at the end of the day, I almost think that we're all being groomed to become straight white men if we reach the top. I mean, this is something that we talk about in our diversity group called FX Mosaic, where we're having these really bizarrely raw and open conversations where we're understanding that to be the surest way to sort of accelerate into leadership positions is to be white adjacent, and how that transfers from our university days and what we've learned as, acceptable, valid, safe design tropes. It's very hard to unlearn that. It's baked into our language. It's baked into our anecdotes. So it's something that we're trying to do at my firm, and we realize we're going to fumble through this quite a bit. But I think that stuff like that needs to happen, where we open it up so that people who are right now in positions of power understand that they have to get far more uncomfortable to sort of do the work that they need to do, and they have to stop looking to people of color to do it for them.
That is true. So a great segue will be, can you talk a little bit about Asian invisibility? So for example, it took how many years? 93 years for Academy to name an Asian descent as a best director, Chloe Zhao. So do you think there will be some influence from this new trend in entertainment industry into architecture? Because the only great names we hear today is Maya Lin or Billy Chen. So what do you think? What is your viewpoint?
Yeah, I do expect that the great talent that we keep to ourselves in the AAPI community will venture out of the shadows. It's starting to happen already, and but it's hard to start to claim the spaces that we've been trained so long to concede to other people. But understanding first, for those of us who are not, as fearless as some of the really exciting new personalities out in the media, is that there is a false sense of security in being silent and invisible. But I think it's also a mistake to shame anyone for their reticence in speaking up or speaking out, because there really does need to be a good amount of courage for someone who knows the consequences of telling their stories. But Maya Lin and Billy Xian are really fantastic creatives and really important standard bearers of the star power that we have latent in the AAPI worlds. But the fact that there's such a desert of Asian recognition around these kind of, these lights, these kind of rock stars, is kind of an example of tokenism working. I think there's a lot of pointing to these figures saying, well, look, you have representation, you should be happy and grateful for that. So I think that's another thing that we have to sort of let go of and stop, being that sort of model good model minority.
Sure, agreed to it. So going back to the academics, like you see the design industry as a whole is represented very highly. The Asian community students are represented there. But when it comes to the practice leadership, or I would say even the lecture series, there's a clear filtering out. So where do you think, in your opinion, this dropout is occurring, or what can be done?
When you look at the metrics, it's pretty clear, if you know how to translate it, that the drop off happens as soon as you get into like senior levels. So even in our own firm, we're looking at the numbers and we're like, oh my God. So, once you get into like senior associate and above, we're looking at our promotion standards and the metrics and the criteria to get promoted. They're still defined, I mean, not just in my company, but across the industry, they're just still defined by patriarchal, Eurocentric ideals and traditions. So, these gates are more narrow and homogenous. And, if you're not extroverted, hyper educated, even from a wealthy background, to understand this kind of like this etiquette, there seems to be, a certain kind of finishing school that people need to go through to feel like there's credibility enough to put them up at these levels. So I think a way to do away with this kind of narrowing of the personas that actually manage to get into leadership levels is to look at breaking down the normal criteria of AREs, lead certification, things that all just kind of homogenize and standardize the products that come out of those.
Those are good points to take on. So I want to talk a little bit about breaking model minority. So typically Asians are portrayed as a model minority due to, I would say, perception of educational and economical success. Mm-hmm. So this mantra that's one size fits all cultural trait not only ignores the ethnic diversity that is Asia, but perpetuates a narrow stereotype. So in your opinion, how do you break free from this narrow definition that frames Asianness?
Well, to break free, I think you really need to understand the myth and where it comes from, right? Because knowing that it's been used as a wedge between Asians and Black and Brown communities is really important in breaking free from believing in it. I never bought into it, but for probably the wrong reasons. I still know plenty of people who prescribe to it of all colors, and that includes Asian people. I mean, to break free, I think you got to talk about real issues and, be real and to be better at allyship and be better to yourself. I used to reject the model minority traps because I was trying to avoid my Asian identity as a kid. It was bringing me all kinds of trouble and isolation, and even as a young adult. So at the moment, I'm much more interested in being free of, the symptoms that come along with the model minority myth, which is, the weight of perfectionism and imposter syndrome that is exacerbated by the myth. And it really hampers your sense of well-being and self-worth. And so knowing that the myth is not a protection, but a prison has made it a lot easier to talk about it and challenge it with friends and family.
Yeah, you made a good point. So can you expand a little bit more on, like, as a firm leader, where do you see opportunities to create more diversity, to bring this thought leadership forward, to uncover the history?
I think there's opportunities everywhere with every single person. And even though it's an exciting time to start, changing the rules and changing the game, there's honestly still a lot of work ahead of us. As we're now moving beyond expressing desires to do better, the actions that we're trying to map out are much more difficult to implement. I think there's still very much a resistance in, the dismantling of old beliefs, which are tied to our habits and our own inward and outward biases. But there is a lot of reason to hope. I think it's important to be prepared to confront denial or indifference. And it's very helpful to sort of get good at that, to continue the work of setting the record straight and then making space for new stories.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think those were all great points you shared with us. Now I would like to open up questions for everyone. I see, Kim, you have a question. Do you want to go ahead and ask?
Sure. Something that really stuck with me that you were speaking about was talking about Jedi justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in your own firm, and taking, I guess, a survey of, not a literal survey, but taking survey of what you were doing and how you were either hindering or helping people to get to the next level. And one thing I thought was really interesting is that you said that the people on the top have to get ready to be uncomfortable. And I guess my question is, how did you as a firm like prepare them or get them to that point in order to have to make them feel comfortable with being uncomfortable, I guess, for the lack of a very better, I'm sure there's a better way to say that.
No, I mean, that's a really good phrase that a lot of people are using. And listen, I'm going to be completely honest, we're not there yet. And I think this is going to be a lifelong journey for everybody in the room at the moment, at the partnership level, the principal level, the leadership levels. And we just had a conversation about how to get unstuck. They've heard those words before. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I don't think people realize what that means. I have one of my great mentors and partners. He mailed a copy of How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi to all the partners. And just sort of on his own. And some people were like, I didn't order this. Where did it come from? With no preamble. It was awesome. But I think we haven't done, so I recommended a book club because we haven't figured out who's read it. We haven't discussed it. And I have two kids, one in high school, one in middle school, and they have all read that book. All the teachers in the PTA are having book clubs about that book. And I think we have to, we have to start, it's not easy. So your question is my question. And, I do take comfort in knowing people like Gabrielle Bullock, who is really on the forefront of Jedi initiatives for Perkins and Will. And we're on the board together at IIDA. Cheryl Durst is this incredible, leader, and she is a huge design champion, but she's also a CEO who's a woman who's Black. Go figure, she's one of a kind. I'm not being euphemistic about that. She has the ability to sort of bring us all into a room and sort of have touch points where we're all recognizing similar struggles. And so we're trading tips on, it almost doesn't matter who the message is coming from, as long as the message gets through. Because, I think Gabrielle made a suggestion to me in that when we have these kind of diversity coaches, it's important to have somebody that you can relate to, somebody that even looks like you. So as much as I want it to be, a book that's written by a Black author about, Black lives, Robin DiAngelo is somebody who is also very effective at getting through to some of these groups. So these are all up in the air questions, and we're all kind of exploring and experimenting.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I won't say my firm, but like I'm assuming most firms, whether large, medium, or small, are struggling with the same thing about how to make those that are in power, who are typically cis white men, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think it's probably a really unique problem, also based on like your firm culture. And then also like our headquarters are in Dallas. So we're at one point, we're like a very Dallas centric firm. So that's like a very different set of ideals that we have. I'm in the DC office. So it's a little difficult when like most of our firm leadership's like in Dallas, and then like we're over here in DC, like we want all of these changes, and they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. So it's good to know that others are going through the same thing.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions? You can go ahead and ask. We still have 10 more minutes.
You know, it's funny because when we have these conversations in the larger official office groups, it still doesn't feel safe. Like I still get sweaty when I'm about to say white supremacy. All right, but we do have these incredible conversations in these smaller rooms with our affinity groups, and we have been talking about how to really shake things up. And I think it's just a matter of time when those two worlds finally meet. But it takes practice. So even though we know that you're going to make mistakes and failure is not the end of the line, it still doesn't make it that much easier to put yourself out there and kind of share what's working and what's not working.
Sure. Any last word of advice to young professionals over here?
Yeah, I feel like what I tell my office, that the younger professionals that I have access to, is, you know, your greatest asset is your own story. And it sounds so corny because it's like, oh yeah, just share your story. How easy could that be? It's not easy. You are your own expert. Like, you know your lived experience, and there's so much that there's so much value that you can offer if you can find a way to be okay with the vulnerability that comes with that. So there's a lot of kind of glib advice out there, you know, be authentic, be real, you know, be good to all this stuff, but there's not a lot of, you know, how do you actually do that? There's not that sort of like instructional pamphlet in terms of, well, you know, be prepared for confusion, be prepared for indifference and apathy even. So I feel like these are all things that I wish somebody had told me. And knowing that when you do encounter those things, in addition to the people who are very receptive and who you resonate with and who you can help, just know that when you do come up against those hurdles, it's to be expected. It's just part of the progress that, you know, you're going to get through. Just a little bit of what you've shared will get through, and then more and more and more.
And one thing, this is a fun question, one thing you would like to change as a young Angie?
Oh, it's yeah, I get this question more often than not, but I feel like I wish I could tell younger me to find a way to understand the rules that apply for me. Hassan Minhaj is one of my favorite entertainers, comedians, journalists. He told a story that resonated very hard for my husband and myself. We're both Korean American. We both don't speak our native tongue. But to know that the rules are just different. And I think my parents had tried to prepare me for that, but I had been sort of banging my head against a brick wall for longer than I should have. If I had just known what was actually ahead of me, I think I would have been smarter about how I communicated, how I learned how to organize the information, how who I advocated for in my storytelling.
Absolutely. That is a great advice. Does anyone have any question for Angie?
We can also sign up early if somebody wants to get a drink or go to the bathroom before the next meeting.
Yeah, Reena has something regarding your name. Thank you, Angie, for sharing your story, especially regarding your name and idea of finishing school to share ideas. Oh, no, that was just a note, probably. Sorry, that was not a question. Yeah, I mean, generally, yeah, so that is your real name, Jane or Angie, because there is what is a real name? That is
my Korean?
Yeah.
Yeah, my Korean name is Yoon Jung. Yoon Jung, very much like the actress who won Best Supporting Actress.
I was thinking that.
Yeah, she's hilarious. But yeah, that's my original name. I still hear that. Like, I don't know if you guys hear your mom yelling at you in your sleep sometimes, but that's still the name I hear when I hear my mom.
Yeah. It's all
like when your mom uses your full name when she's really mad at you. Yeah.
I still hear.
So you're really thankful, Angie, for joining us today and sharing your stories with us and sharing your thoughts and inspiring us further. And yeah, we'll see everybody in the next general body meeting in June. I think it is on the 3rd, I believe. Yeah, so thank you again, Angie.
Thank you
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angie.
Bye.